Hello everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. My name is Sahar Paksat. I'm the Marketing and Communications Coordinator at Clone Crippen Berger. In today's webinar, our speaker will talk about mine waste geochemistry and will present several design cases. If you have any questions during the webinar, you can submit them by entering them in the questions box in the GoToWebinar panel on your screen. We will compile the questions and we'll send you a summary of the questions and answers after the webinar. Also, a copy of today's presentation is available to download from the Handouts section. Lastly, an on-demand recording of this webinar will be available on our website at clone.com. You will get an email about it as well. So today's presenter is Dr. Brent Usher. He is a senior hydrogeochemist and an associate at our Clone Crippen Berger office in Brisbane. He has over 20 years of experience in mine waste geochemistry, aqueous geochemistry, and hydrogeology. Brent's experience spans Australian and international projects, and he has worked on mine water and mine water quality projects for over 100 mine sites worldwide. Over to you, Brent.
Thank you, Sahar. Welcome, everybody. Sahar said today I'll be covering several topics in mine waste geochemistry and looking at some design cases to see how we apply the principles of acid mine drainage chemistry to our designs. So just an overview of the comments there, content. We will start with some ARD or acid rock drainage basics, and please note that I'll be using the terms acid rock drainage and acid mine drainage interchangeably. After discussing those basics, which will include the basic reactions as well as a very short overview of some of the techniques to understand and predict the occurrence of acid mine drainage, we will run into a few KCB case studies that provide more detail about how to apply these principles as part of your design. I've also added in the slides all the references, so all the slides that have a star have a reference to one of the KCB or public domain publications that relate to the topic on the slide, and these will be provided with the slides after the presentation. So what is acid mine drainage or acid rock drainage? Well, this is probably the most important slide to look at because we will be coming back to this over several slides throughout the presentation. It is the consequence of the oxidation of sulfide minerals and the transport of the reaction products from the oxidation reaction, usually by water. In general, what this results in is acidic waters with a high dissolved metal content and usually associated with sulfates, and on a mine site, usually associated with mine waste sources or with the mine voids themselves. As I've said there in the third bullet, the consequences of AMD depend largely on the reactivity of the source material, the geochemical conditions under which that source exists, and on the receiving environment. So in other words, how quickly those reaction products can get to a susceptible receptor and how reactive that material is. Very important, acid drainage is only one end member of this entire process. What we often also see is neutral mine drainage, which can be associated with high salt content and other metals. But we'll get to those in a few future slides. So just some definitions to put that all into context. So typically we focus on the pH range, and I'm using a slide here from the GUARD guide. The process, the reactions of acid mine drainage can cause a pH all the way through to highly acidic, so the reds to the left, all the way through to far more neutral pHs on the right-hand side of that graph. And the definitions that are used are the acidic ones, obviously with a pH below neutral, and or neutral mine drainage and saline drainage for those that are neutral to alkaline. I'll demonstrate a few of these in some slides, but generally major concerns that we are concerned about are the acidic pHs, where we have moderate to elevated heavy metals. And in almost all of these cases, we can have elevated sulfates and other salts. And for the neutral mine drainage cases, some other metals of concern. So here are some of the detailed reactions. And just to reassure you, we're not going to spend a lot of time on the details of the reactions. The important thing for us to focus on today really is that what we see there are the 4 reactions that usually are ascribed to the process of acid mine drainage. So what we see there in the first reaction is an iron sulfide, usually pyrite, which reacts with oxygen and water to give us as products iron in the 2 valent state, iron 2 plus sulfate plus the 2H plus, which is an indication of the acidity. Now that is just a starting reaction. Reactions 2, 3, and 4, as you can see, also generate further acidity. So if we look, for example, at reaction 3, which is the conversion of iron 3 into the precipitate there, yellow boy, that generates some further acidity. And then even further, once we have iron 3, that can in itself act as an oxidant to give us further iron and acidity. So it becomes a self-perpetuating cycle, which is why our focus in design is usually to try and reduce the reactivity or stop the reactions from occurring. So bottom line that we'll focus on throughout this presentation, sulfides plus water plus oxygen in the presence of bacteria give us acidity plus sulfate and precipitates and or metals. And all of those can be important for our designs. So basic recipe, and I'm going to repeat this basic recipe throughout the presentation. Sulfite minerals, usually pyrite, react with oxygen and water to generate acidity, sulfate, and iron. And because this is an exothermic reaction, this also generates heat, and that becomes important with the consumption and transport of oxygen to facilitate this process. Associated with the generation of acidity, in most cases, we have neutralization that occurs. And that neutralization is usually from coexisting carbonate minerals. The resultant pH from that process depends on the balance between the reactivity of the acid generating sulfides and the neutralizing minerals such as the carbonates. Based on that associated load and or pH, we get differing consequences. And very importantly for our designs too, those reaction products often form some precipitates. I'm going to show you a few examples here just of how this looks like, because often the engineers are asking us, what does AMD look like? So I'll start there with and it's a very acidic mine pit. So pH 1.5 water, as you can see there, very red waters, high in precipitates, and you can see the red precipitates forming there on the edge once we get into a more oxygen-rich environment. Here's an example from a metal mine. So on the top left there, you can see the acidic water that's collected at the bottom of that start of a pit. And if we zoom in closer, again, we see precipitates and other acidic salts forming in the top right figure, and then that acidic water with the precipitation of the iron precipitates in the bottom picture there. In an old tailing storage facility, we can see down near the bottom of that TSF, you can see there on the left-hand photo there is myself and one of my colleagues there for scale. We can see the accumulation of those precipitates at the bottom of that TSF. And if we zoom in there closer, we can really see some of those acidic secondary minerals that form. And in this case, that includes some acidic minerals such as jarosite. Next to that particular TSF, we can also see some white precipitates which form there. In this case, those are largely gypsum, which is calcium sulfate, and some acidic salts which co-precipitate with those. So in this case, we're seeing both the water as well as the precipitation products from that acid mine drainage process. So, as I mentioned, the AMD is often neutralized by coexisting buffering mechanisms, and they can, to various degrees, stop the drop in pH. So what we usually see is that the neutralization occurs due to several processes, starting with the alkalinity in the water, then followed by the carbonate minerals, then followed by the hydroxides, and then all the way down at very low pHs, some of the silicates can add some neutralization. The important bit, though, is that it is usually only the carbonate minerals, so that is usually the calcium-containing ones, calcite and dolomite, that are effective in neutralizing this process sufficiently to prevent acidification. And that is because the rates at which the acidity gets generated and the rates at which many of those hydroxides and silicates can react are not well matched. So it's only the carbonates that are effective usually in preventing that precipitation. So showing the reaction right at the bottom there, we've got pyrite, and you need twice as much in terms of moles of calcite to neutralize that, and the reaction product from that full reaction still gives us a whole bunch of calcium and sulfate and iron too, which then can precipitate. So just because it's neutralized does not mean that there are no other reaction products. So as a generalized sequence, this is what we see. Often a long period of neutral conditions, and that's where the carbonates would be effective. Then we see a drop to about a pH of 5 or 4.5, and that's where your hydroxides would be effective at buffering the pH drop, and then it often drops very rapidly to pHs of below 4 and then below 3, depending on the reactivity of your particular mine waste. So where we don't have enough neutralizing minerals, usually highly acidic water, there's an example of some nice red mine wine with a low pH of below 3 in this case. So just to re-emphasize the environmental significance, usually for acid mine drainage, so on the left-hand side there, we have sulfate on the y-axis and pH, sulfate on the y-axis and pH on the bottom x-axis. As the pH drops, generally we get sulfates and salinity being significantly higher than in the neutral cases where we've got either saline drainage or neutral mine drainage. And that's why a lot of the focus in design and in our understanding is on understanding what the final pH might be. More importantly is when we consider some of these common minerals that can be problematic. So just looking at the summation of some minerals there on the y-axis, we can see that as the pH drops, we get orders of magnitude more metals that typically go into solution than under neutral conditions. And that is why we often focus on the eventual pH and try and prevent the low pH waters from occurring on a mine site. So while the low pH water is the focus, and that increases both the reactivity of the mine waste and the metal release, what is important as well is that just because it's not currently acidic does not mean the process is not occurring. So if you are at a mine site where there are sulfides and you see neutral conditions and an increase in salinity, for example, you may be seeing the process of acid mine drainage occurring. And it's important to understand that in addition to the salinity that occurs under neutral conditions, there are other metals and metalloids of concern, things like arsenic, molybdenum, or selenium, that can still be released. So while the acid part of it is the focus, that reaction and the reaction products that occur from it are important for the environmental consequences. So here's an example at a waste rock dump, just looking at the toe there where we have some neutral mine drainage, so an accumulation of calcium sulfate, so gypsum, and when you analyze that gypsum, there are a whole host of metals that have co-precipitated in there. So while that is not acidic, there is still an issue with salinity and with some of the other metals that occur. So the next step, of course, is trying to understand how to predict which of these processes is going to occur. Now, that in itself could be a seminar all by itself, and I won't go into that into a lot of detail today. I'll just give you some highlights so you can understand the context. As geochemists, we have several tools, and on the right-hand side there, I'm showing you the so-called mine water prediction toolbox or wheel of different tools that we can use to go and predict the eventual mine drainage chemistry from a mine site. The important thing for you to understand is the context of each of these types of tools, and that's more importantly, for us to have confidence, we really need to use a combination of these tools to give us a consistent understanding of the mine waste or mine source, such as a void, which can generate poor mine water quality. So there are four very broad classes of prediction tools: static methods, kinetic methods, geochemical modeling, and methods that we can use in the field. And I'm just going to touch on those very briefly over the next few slides. As non-geochemists, the important thing to understand is which tools to use when. So static tests are the tests that we take and do assays or once-off tests in the laboratory, generally to give us an understanding of the balance between the potential acid generation in a sample and the potential for neutralization in that sample. So that's known as acid-base accounting. We will also, in static tests, try and understand what the metal content is of particular samples. The very important thing for us to understand is that the static tests do not give us the rates at which those processes can occur. And for us to get those rates, we need to use other tests. So that is where we need to use tools like kinetic tests. What we usually do in most of our projects to understand this is combine the data from both the static tests and the conceptualization, as well as ideally kinetic tests and some hydrogeochemical modeling to predict the water quality changes over time. And that's really where we can integrate both the design elements and the fundamental geochemistry of acid mine drainage. So, as non-geochemists, the important bits for you to understand is to clearly define what you want out of the testing, know the limitations, place the results of the testing into the context with a conceptual understanding of the geochemical conditions, and always use several methods so that you can have confidence in the results of that assessment. Just some examples there. There's some kinetic tests. So running all the way through from humidity cells on the left there, some kinetic leach columns on the right, some very cheap humidity cells that were constructed for a project on the top right, and there in the center, some field cells. So the principle with all of these kinetic tests is that we would have a well-characterized mass of samples. So that would range from 1 to 2 kilograms in some of these humidity cells, all the way through to several hundred kilograms in a field cell. And these would be regularly leached, and we would measure the water quality changes over time, and from that understand the relative rates of reaction and the relative rates of the production of metals or the likelihood of acid water being generated. So how do we use all of this? I'm going to now run through a few design cases. In the first case, we're going to circle back to the basic recipe and show how we use water to limit oxygen and therefore to lower the reactivity of some mine waste. So the basic principle here is that we will use water to act as a barrier between the atmosphere and the reactive mine waste that we are trying to manage. This can happen either in specific facilities, so custom designed storage ponds where we place this waste, or where we go and replace mine waste deep in a permanent pit lake with sufficient cover of water, or where we keep the tailings at a high enough moisture content so that the oxygen cannot be transported readily to react with those sulfide minerals and generate the reaction products. So circling back to the basic recipe, what we're trying to do here is eliminate the oxygen part of that recipe. And if we can eliminate the oxygen, then we can prevent the sulfide minerals from reacting. So I'm going to show you a few case studies here. Obviously, important when we use this particular approach is that we need to have confidence that there will be a permanent cover of water, and generally these are more suitable for higher rainfall environments. So the designs in all these cases are such that we keep several meters of water cover above the waste, and that the water then acts to prevent oxygen from reaching the sulfide minerals in this waste. And by doing that, we can lower the reactivity or prevent the sulfide oxidation from occurring. The alternative is that we have a high enough water content to prevent the oxygen from being transported to the mine waste. So here is an example from one of the mine sites KCB has been working on for more than 3 decades. So this is out in PNG, where we're looking at the Bigay stockpiles with a pyrite concentrate disposal cell in the background. So that water-filled pond that you see at the top right of the figure is a specifically designed storage cell. What we've placed in there is the highly reactive pyrite concentrate from the process under several meters of water. And what that has shown over time through monitoring is that by placing the pyrite concentrate under the water, we've effectively stopped the reactivity of that highly reactive mine waste. For another example, we used long-term kinetic tests. So these were tests that ran for several years, where firstly in the lab we demonstrated the viability of keeping highly reactive pyritic waste underwater, again in a high rainfall area in the tropics. For this particular project, what we did was we, with the client, designed long-term kinetic tests which maintained the waste under this water, and we monitored the water quality results over time. And the important bit there is that those remain submerged. So what we can see here from the lab results, and this is just an example there, is through those different columns, and you can see we had different sampling ports in those. Over the period of several years of testing, we were able to maintain in the lab a very neutral pH, and that actually over time, the pH started increasing. So that gave both ourselves and the client, as well as their reviewers, confidence that if we could build a similar system in the field, we could lower the reactivity of the waste and therefore store it safely for the long term. The final example here I'm going to show is from a TSF in a wet tropical environment. So this comes from the closure plan concept for the Hidden Valley TSF1, and I'll refer you back to a seminar that my colleague Mark Raynaud did several months ago, which was specifically geared towards talking about this particular TSF. So at closure, one of the concerns is to try and balance the geotechnical requirements of stability in this environment with the geochemical considerations. In other words, we want to get a balance between keeping this facility geotechnically stable and reducing the reactivity of the tailings so that they do not generate salinity, they do not become acidic, and they do not generate further metals. So what we had to balance there is not having a pond on this facility at closure, but at the same time keeping sufficient moisture content in the tailings so that we could limit the oxygen ingress to that to the tailings. So the proposed solution is that at closure, we will the mine will remove the pond and treat the pond water. We will place a cover on the final tailing surface. That'll be a cover of coarse material. That coarse material has two functions, or several functions. Firstly, to protect the tailings from erosion, in other words, a surface across which the water can flow, which then can also allow the engineers to engineer the flow path for the water and protect the tailings in that manner. But at the same time, that coarse cover allows sufficient rainfall to infiltrate through the cover and therefore keep the tailings water content sufficiently high so that we can use the presence of that water to limit the rate at which oxygen can infiltrate the tailings. And if we limit the oxygen, we can then limit the reactivity of those tailings into closure, and therefore balance both the geotechnical requirements as well as the closure geotechnical requirements for this facility. So for the next case study, I'm going to show an example of how we can link geochemistry to the day-to-day decision-making on a mine site. So for this particular case study, what I'll be showing here is from a very long-running water quality model that we've developed for a client. This model has been used and is used by the client on a very regular basis for planning, for their regulatory engagements, and for their closure considerations. And the client uses this particular hydrogeochemical or water quality prediction model as part of their decision making. So this forms part of both their mine planning process as well as their financial planning process for both operations and closure. Just as an aside, there has been a recent article in AusIMM Journal to show what the benefits are if a mine site proactively manages a lot of these issues early in the process rather than at closure. And I'd encourage you to go and have a look at that particular article, which is in the reference list that I'll provide. So for this case study, what we developed with the client there is a fully functional water quality model, which they can use for decision making, planning and assessment. And all I'm showing there is a model dashboard that the mine site uses so that they themselves have control over the simulations that this model can provide. The approach that we used here is this is a fully integrated water balance and water quality model. The model simulates the geochemistry of each of the mining components separately. So that's the different waste rock dumps. We've got some reactive waste, some less reactive waste, a really big tailings storage facility, an open pit which generates a whole heap of mine waste every day, and a very complex mine water management system. We've used all the geochemical testing that the mine has done over time, as well as the mine's ongoing water quality monitoring record. And we've been comparing the model predictions to the field observations over time so that the client and ourselves can have confidence that the model predictions provide a valid basis for them to use the model for their planning, assessment, costing and closure considerations. I'm going to run through this relatively quickly, but just circling back to the mine waste characterization. So a lot of testing done here. So all those types I showed previously: static testing, kinetic testing, mineralogy. The kinetic testing that has been completed includes both laboratory testing, some of the field cells shown there in the top figure, and at this particular mine site, some instrumented field piles, which test the water quality changes over time for different waste types. And then also the mine has a fairly large water quality monitoring database that can be used to both understand the geochemistry and to go and calibrate this model. So in terms of understanding the geochemistry, we've used both the observations as well as several prediction tools. So what I'm showing there is just some examples there of understanding absorption using Geochemist Workbench, and then also understanding the controls on copper solubility as a function of pH. So that's from the mine site and from the field barrels, and then also using frequency as well as site observations to compare the relative saturation of a mineral. In this case, it's malachite, which is that nice green mineral shown at that particular on that particular photo at the top right, versus just below it the assessment of the relative degree of saturation theoretically using a model called frequency. So using all of that, we can then build an integrated water balance and water quality model. In each of these boxes there, which are containers in GoldSim, we've used GoldSim to build this. We go and unpack the geochemistry and the hydrology of each of the individual components of the mine, and then we go and in each of these time steps go and calculate the geochemical changes that occur over time. And from that, we can then have a water quality which then can be used in the predictions. For this particular mine site, I'll show you on one of the later slides. We do comparisons between the predictions and the measured water quality at various points. I'm just showing you an example of the calibration between the modeled and real water qualities for one of the waste rock dumps. They do use this at several of their water quality monitoring points, so that there is an ongoing dashboard for them to use to go compare the water quality predictions and the water quality results from the monitoring. Using this, they've then been able to go and simulate a whole host of different mine waste and mine water quality options, including aspects such as water treatment, segregation of waste, using different multi-criteria analyses to understand the critical water quality drivers, understanding what the impact would be of different waste placement strategies, and then to use all of that in the context of both the cost benefit of spending the money to do these alternatives versus the environmental compliance and the risks. So that's a really good example of where that is all used together. For the third design case, I'm going to show some considerations within the waste rock dumps to show how we can understand both the geochemistry and use that geochemistry to inform our designs. So in this case, we're again going to look at how we can limit the availability of oxygen for our most reactive waste that we place in a waste rock dump. So waste rock, obviously far coarser than tailings, a very wide range of particle sizes. Very important for us is that leads to preferential flows under both saturated and unsaturated conditions, and that also gives us different pathways for the oxygen and the water to react with the sulfide containing waste. So there's just an example from one of the waste rock dumps where we've dug a few trenches. We can see it goes all the way from the very fine material from one of the trenches to very, very coarse right next door. So highly variable in a waste rock dump. So the important bit for us, and this is a conceptual cartoon from the Guard Guide, is that through these preferential pathways and through the reactivity of the waste, we get infiltration of oxygen. So the cold air would typically come in and be channeled along the more permeable pathways, and therefore provides one of the components of that recipe. We can keep generating or keep having sulfide oxidation as long as we have sufficient water and oxygen reacting with this mine waste. So what can we do about it? Well, here is an example where we've used some modeling to go and understand this interaction between the pyrite oxidation, the supply of the oxygen, the convection of the gas, and the heat that gets generated within a particular waste rock facility. By modeling all of that, for this particular case study, we could go and use their instrumented bores within this waste facility to understand all the factors that influence, I guess, the reactivity, which would be the airflow, the gas, particularly the oxygen consumption, and the heat generation within that waste rock facility. So by using tools such as TUF2 or using the GeoStudio modules, we can go and understand the evolution of the air profiles, the oxygen profiles, and the reactivity within these facilities. So once again, yeah, we've taken the approach to link the dynamic changes in airflow, water quality, airflow, reactivity, temperature, and link that to the water quality so that we can go and understand how different design options or different cover options can improve the short and long-term loads that come from this particular facility. So let's have a look at some results here. Firstly, we have a dump that we've modeled. At the top there, without any cover, two important things to note. At the top is the air flux, mostly along those batters on the left and right hand side. That's where we see most of the air flux coming in, and depending on the steepness and length of those batters, we get different amounts of air flux into that particular facility. That translates to the reactivity. So what we see at the bottom there is just the temperature. The more air we get into this facility, the higher the oxygen content. The higher the oxygen content, the more the higher the reactions. And because that's an exothermic reaction, we get more temperature or higher temperatures generated within the dump. So what can we do about this? Well, I guess from a WRD design perspective, what modeling like this emphasizes is that we really want to place the most reactive materials as deep into this facility as possible. In other words, as far away from the oxygen pathways as possible, because by doing that, we can reduce the sulfide oxidation. So typically what we would do is go and place the most reactive material in the guts of the waste rock dump, and we will have interim covers as well as final covers to reduce the reactivity. What modeling like this also shows us is that by disrupting those paths, we can go and reduce the reactivity of the waste. So in other words, by having lower lifts or by using different dump placement methodologies, we can go and reduce the availability of oxygen and therefore the reactivity of that waste. So there's just one example there on the left with no controls. We can see the infiltration of both the gas and the reactivity, the temperature showing the reactivity of the waste. On the right-hand side with an alternative, in other words, shorter lifts, also with interim covers and then a final cover at the end, we can greatly reduce the reactivity of that waste and limit the loads that come from that facility. So in terms of some of the design implications, where we place the waste is important. Get it away from the oxygen, so don't put it under the batters. Try and put that within a cover of some non-acid forming materials. In terms of placing it, the shorter we expose the materials, the better. The more we can compact that material, the less we can the greater we can limit the oxygen transport, and therefore the less reactive it would be. And then in terms of covers, both the timing of those covers and the properties of those covers to limit both water and oxygen are important, but limiting the gas flow is far more important in terms of limiting the reactivity of that waste. So for the final design consideration, let's look at some mineral precipitates and the effects these might have on the stability. So back to our recipe. In this case, we're looking at the sulfide minerals generating both acidity and sulfate, and that the reaction products often form precipitates. So in this case study, we've used all the tools in that toolbox, including some images there from electron microscope work to understand how these secondary minerals form and what the drivers are in different facilities. So several static tests have been done there. At the bottom there, we're showing just some electron microscope images for that. The important bit is, what are the implications? Once we have these precipitates that form in mine waste, the materials do not behave from a geotechnical perspective as what was the original intent or as the design may have indicated. By having these secondary minerals in the matrices of the materials, we can go and change the geotechnical properties. That's not all. As we can see there, when we get precipitation, and I'm showing some iron precipitates there, what happens is, through these precipitates, we can block the pathways of water, and that means the water has to find different pathways to exit from a facility, and that can often be in areas where they have not been designed to take that flow. So by combining all of this into an understanding of what happens in a facility, in this case it's a tailings dam, we can go and understand where these precipitates are likely to form, and we can go and, by working with the engineers, go and put in designs that can limit the occurrence of these precipitates or allow them to occur in areas where we can better engineer this. So just to show you some examples there, here is a drain which has been almost fully clogged by the precipitation of mostly iron oxyhydroxide precipitates. By clogging that drain, the flow path out of the tailings facility has been limited or reduced, and that means that the water flow path has to find another pathway. The implications for engineering are that we can then get aspects like flows where we haven't engineered it, we can get buildup of pore pressures, or we can get drains which do not meet their design mine life because of the formation of precipitates. So there are ways for us to understand that and to design around that. So in terms of our overall so what, hopefully this presentation has indicated that mine waste geochemistry is not just a black box and a nice to have on design projects for engineers. There are very important reasons, both from an environmental as well as from an engineering design perspective, to include geochemistry as part of these projects. The important bit to remember, the tools are available. We have been able to apply them on several case studies, and where we can integrate the geochemistry with the other disciplines, particularly design engineering, is where we can get the most benefit to mining projects. By integrating the geochemistry with your designs, you can save a whole bunch of effort and, as importantly, save time and money in both operations and at closure. Thank you very much. We will be taking some questions via this webinar, and I will be providing you with a list of references as well as these slides after this webinar. Thank you for your time.